The moment Prince Harry discovered the truth, his world tilted on its axis. Imagine standing in the room you call home, believing in the foundation of love and trust, only for everything to crumble in an instant. Did you ever think that even the seemingly perfect life could harbor secrets so dark they would haunt you forever? Harry, a prince who had faced the public eye since birth, had always been prepared for scrutiny, for criticism, for judgment. But nothing could have prepared him for the betrayal that would come from the one person he trusted most, his wife. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. The story begins not with a scandal reported in tabloids or whispered in gossip columns, but in the private corridors of a palace that has long been a symbol of perfection, tradition, and untouchable royalty. Harry's life, often portrayed as a fairy tale with its glittering events and global attention, had its undercurrents of tension and unease. Marriages, even among royalty, are not immune to the strains of expectation, secrecy, and isolation. But what happened in this case was not just a strain, it was a rupture. And the rupture came in the form of a betrayal so intimate, so repeated, and so shocking that it forced a reconsideration of everything Harry had believed about love, loyalty, and the very people around him. You might wonder what exactly happened. Who could have imagined that a trusted bodyguard, someone sworn to protect and serve, could be entangled in a web of secrecy and intimacy with a royal spouse? And why would such a betrayal remain hidden, cloaked in the velvet of palace discretion and silenced by fear? The answers to these questions are not straightforward, and they reveal a side of royal life the public rarely sees. There is a darkness behind the glitz, a vulnerability behind the crown, and a heartbreak behind the pomp and ceremony. The affair, as shocking as it was, did not occur once or twice. Multiple encounters, discreet and deliberate, allegedly unfolded over months, each one a dagger in the heart of a relationship that had once seemed unbreakable. But betrayal is never just about the act itself. It is about the erosion of trust, the ripple effect of suspicion, and the emotional turmoil that follows. Harry's discovery of these events forced him to confront not just his wife's choices, but also his own role in the dynamics that allowed such secrecy to flourish. And then there is the question of timing. Why reveal this now? Why has the story emerged when it did? Royals, historically, have managed perception with meticulous care. They understand the power of timing, the significance of public image, and the devastating impact of private scandals made public. Harry's revelation, therefore, is not just a personal confession. It is a seismic event in the world of modern monarchy, where every statement, every action, and every disclosure is scrutinized with relentless intensity. The palace, as it often does, becomes both stage and battlefield. Staff who once moved silently in the background now become key players in a drama that could not remain hidden. Conversations whispered in hallways, fleeting glances, and subtle changes in routine all take on new significance once betrayal enters the picture. And for Harry, every interaction, every gesture, and every memory is filtered through the lens of suspicion and hurt. What was once ordinary becomes suspect. What was once innocent becomes evidence. But this story is not only about betrayal. It is about the complexity of human emotion, the collision of public duty with private despair, and the impossible expectations placed upon individuals who live their lives under constant scrutiny. Can love survive under such pressure? Can forgiveness exist in the aftermath of repeated deception? These questions do not have easy answers, and they form the emotional core of the narrative that is about to unfold. Imagine, for a moment, being Harry in that very palace, walking down corridors where generations of royalty had once found peace and purpose, only to encounter reminders of a love that was not as it seemed. Every corner, every room, becomes a stage for memory and suspicion, and the person you had trusted the most, the person who shared your dreams, your hopes, and your home, suddenly embodies the contradiction between public appearance and private reality. This is the essence of betrayal, the shattering of perception, the collision of expectation with reality, and the revelation that the world you thought you knew is far more complex than you ever imagined. But what makes this story truly compelling is not just the act of betrayal itself, but the repeated nature of it, the audacity, and the sheer emotional impact it has on the victim. Harry, accustomed to navigating crises, scandals, and public opinion, finds himself powerless against something deeply personal and intimate. This is not a political maneuver, a misinterpreted comment, or a public misstep. This is a betrayal that strikes at the heart, at the core of trust, and at the very essence of personal connection. And yet, despite the heartbreak and disbelief, the story must continue. There are layers yet to be revealed, details that cast new light on the relationships involved, on the dynamics of secrecy, and on the motivations of those at the center of this drama. Each revelation adds a new twist, a new emotional spike, and a new question that demands an answer. How could this have happened? Who else was aware? What was truly at stake? And, perhaps most importantly, what happens when the truth finally comes to light? Harry's experience is not unique, though it is magnified by the circumstances of royalty. Betrayal is universal. It is a human experience that resonates across cultures, classes, and generations. What makes this story different, however, is the lens through which we view it. The combination of privilege, scrutiny, and expectation that transforms a personal tragedy into a public spectacle. The stakes are higher, the consequences more visible, and the emotional impact amplified by the knowledge that millions are watching, judging, and reacting to every revelation. As we move deeper into this story, keep in mind the human dimension behind the headlines. Behind every scandal is a web of relationships, emotions, and decisions that are rarely straightforward. Behind every public statement is a private reality that is often far messier, more complicated, and more painful than anyone could imagine. And behind every revelation is a cascade of consequences that will reverberate long after the initial shock has faded. What follows is a journey into the heart of a betrayal that shook not just a marriage, but the very institution that surrounds it. It is a story of trust lost and tested, of love questioned and challenged, and of a truth so shocking that it demands to be told in full detail. And yet, even as we prepare to uncover every layer, one question remains. How does one reconcile the public image of perfection with the private reality of deception? How does one navigate a world where intimacy and betrayal coexist in the shadows? The answers will come, chapter by chapter, revelation by revelation. Each story beat will deepen your understanding, heighten your curiosity, and bring you closer to the truth that Prince Harry has now confirmed. And as we begin this journey, one thing is certain. The events that are about to unfold will challenge everything you think you know about loyalty, love, and the hidden lives of those we believe we understand. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The palace corridors gleamed with polished perfection, each reflection a reminder of centuries of tradition and protocol. To an outsider, life within these walls seemed flawless, grand events, glittering appearances, and a family revered around the world. But behind the gilded doors, beneath the surface of ceremonial pomp, lay a reality far more complex, far more fragile, and far more human than anyone could imagine. Before the storm of betrayal arrived, Prince Harry's world appeared to be a bubble of love, duty, and expectation. It was a life many envied, yet one few truly understood. Imagine waking up every day in a life that is simultaneously coveted and constricted. Every smile, every handshake, every public gesture is scrutinized, analyzed, and debated. Every private moment carries the weight of history and legacy. This was Harry's existence. A constant balancing act between personal desire and public obligation. And at the center of this carefully curated existence was his marriage, a union that, to the outside world, represented fairy tale perfection. Harry and his wife were the picture of modern royalty, charismatic, media-savvy, and admired across continents. Yet, like every marriage, it contained unspoken tensions, compromises, and small fissures hidden behind smiles and polite conversation. In the early days, everything seemed aligned. Harry, the young prince who had spent years grappling with personal tragedy, found in his spouse a partner who could navigate the limelight, who could understand the burdens of expectation. Together, they moved through the rituals of royal life, attending charity events, meeting dignitaries, and fulfilling the roles expected of them. To the public, They were a perfect pair, an emblem of youthful energy and noble purpose. But perfection, as Harry would come to realize, is often a fragile veneer, easily fractured by secrets and human desire. Even in a life filled with grandeur, small moments of doubt or tension can grow into chasms if left unaddressed. Harry, acutely aware of the pressures surrounding him, had learned to mask his insecurities to maintain composure in the face of public scrutiny. Yet, beneath that composed exterior, there existed a longing for genuine connection, for intimacy that was untainted by expectation. The palace, with all its history and ritual, offered little of that. Love, when lived in the shadows of constant observation, required negotiation, compromise, and sometimes silent endurance. The early stages of their marriage were a dance between public image and private reality. Hand in hand, they navigated the world's gaze, each appearance meticulously choreographed, each smile carefully calibrated. And yet, the intimacy that exists in private relationships, the quiet glances, the spontaneous laughter, the reassurance that comes without audience or applause, was always tempered by the awareness that their lives were being watched. In such an environment, even small deviations or missteps take on amplified significance. What might seem inconsequential in a normal relationship becomes loaded with meaning, potential scandal, or public judgment. To outsiders, this life appears enviable: opulent residences, influence, and access to people and experiences beyond the reach of most. But within the royal bubble, these privileges carry a hidden cost: isolation, constant vigilance, and the relentless pressure to conform to expectations that are often unattainable. Harry's early marriage, in this context, was not just a partnership between two people. It was a balancing act within an institution, a negotiation between desire and duty. And as anyone who has lived under constant scrutiny knows, the line between public persona and private reality can blur until it becomes nearly impossible to distinguish where one ends and the other begins. Yet, even within this constricted environment, there were moments of genuine happiness. Laughter shared in private rooms, whispered conversations away from prying eyes, and small acts of affection that reminded Harry why he had committed to this partnership. These moments, though fleeting, offered a glimpse of what a life unburdened by expectation could feel like. And they were the moments that made the eventual betrayal all the more devastating. The contrast between intimacy and deceit, between love and betrayal, would sting with amplified intensity because the memory of genuine connection existed. But cracks were already forming, invisible to the outside world, but palpable to those who lived within the palace. Subtle shifts in behavior, unspoken tensions during official events, and fleeting moments of withdrawal began to suggest that all was not as harmonious as it seemed. These were not dramatic confrontations, but quiet indicators of friction: the slight hesitation in a glance, a half-smile that didn't reach the eyes, the uncharacteristic silence in shared moments. To the untrained eye, these are inconsequential, but to someone attuned to the rhythms of a relationship, they signal something deeper, a warning that all is not well. It was within this environment of subtle unease that the first hints of betrayal would emerge. Harry, already navigating the complex world of royal expectations, would soon encounter the emotional earthquake that no training, preparation, or privilege could have shielded him from. The palace, with its centuries of tradition and history, suddenly became a stage for personal drama, where trust would be tested and secrets would come to light in ways that would reverberate far beyond the walls of royalty. And yet, before the betrayal, there were layers of normalcy, layers that made the eventual revelations so shocking. Friends and aides observed moments of happiness, smiles exchanged in private, laughter during off-duty hours. It was easy for anyone, including Harry himself, to cling to these fragments of normalcy, to believe that the love and trust he had built were solid. But deception, as he would soon learn, often hides behind these very fragments, weaving its presence into the fabric of everyday life until the moment of revelation arrives. Consider the irony: a life designed to celebrate unity, love, and fidelity could simultaneously conceal the very opposite. A trusted household, devoted staff, and carefully curated routines created a sense of security, even as cracks widened beneath the surface. The bubble of royal life, with all its privileges and constraints, was both protective and isolating. And in this paradox lay the perfect environment for betrayal to flourish, unseen, unchallenged, and ultimately devastating when uncovered. The tension, though subtle at first, began to mount as Harry noticed inconsistencies, small slips in stories, unusual interactions, and moments of hesitation that hinted at something unsaid. These were the breadcrumbs that would eventually lead to the discovery of multiple incidents of intimacy between his wife and the bodyguard, but at this stage, they were merely unsettling anomalies. Yet, in retrospect, each anomaly was a warning, a signal of the storm that would soon engulf the royal household. And as he navigated these moments of uncertainty, Harry was forced to reconcile the public persona of perfection with the private reality of human imperfection. Could love truly survive in a world where appearances matter more than truth? Could trust withstand repeated deception? These were not abstract questions. They were the emotional undercurrent of every day, every interaction, and every decision within the palace walls. Then came the moments that would define the beginning of the unraveling. Subtle, yet unmistakable, a glance too long, a whisper too cautious, an absence at the wrong time. Each incident was a thread, and each thread contributed to the unraveling of what had seemed like a tightly knit tapestry of love and loyalty. Harry, attuned to the rhythms of his life and the subtleties of human behavior, sensed the shift before it fully revealed itself. And when the first undeniable evidence emerged, the shock was magnified precisely because he had once believed in the perfection of the bubble surrounding him. In those early days, the realization of betrayal was not immediate, but the tension built inexorably. Suspicion gave way to confirmation, and confirmation led to heartbreak. Each day brought new revelations, each encounter layered with emotion, and each private moment became fraught with the knowledge that trust had been broken. And yet, the public remained unaware. The smile on Harry's face, the composure in appearances, and the grace in official duties concealed the emotional turmoil churning beneath the surface. It is this duality, the coexistence of public poise and private devastation, that makes the story so compelling. The very institution designed to protect and preserve appearances inadvertently amplifies the impact of personal betrayal. The palace, with all its rituals, traditions, and observers, becomes a mirror reflecting not just the grandeur of royalty, but also the vulnerability of the human heart. And for Harry, each reflection was a reminder that what he had believed to be true was now irreparably questioned. The royal bubble, which once seemed a sanctuary, had transformed into a crucible. Here, expectations, duty, love, and secrecy collided, creating an environment where deception could thrive undetected. And it was within this crucible that Harry would encounter the multiple incidents of intimacy, betrayal, and duplicity that would redefine his understanding of love, loyalty, and trust. The stage was set, the characters in place, and the tension mounting. What had once been a marriage characterized by hope and promise now teetered on the edge of exposure and emotional devastation. The bubble of royal life, so carefully curated and meticulously maintained, was about to burst. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. When you think of a bodyguard, the image that comes to mind is loyalty, vigilance, and unwavering protection. Someone whose job is to anticipate threats before they materialize. Someone whose presence is a silent reassurance in a chaotic world. For Prince Harry, that image had always been true, until it wasn't. Because trust, as Harry would learn, is a fragile thing. And the person sworn to protect him, to shield him from harm, was about to become central to a betrayal that would shatter not only his perception of safety, but the very foundation of his marriage. From the outside, the bodyguard's presence seemed routine. He moved through the palace corridors like a shadow, ever watchful, ever vigilant. Observers noted his professionalism, the meticulous attention to detail, and the calm demeanor that marked someone trained to handle any emergency. His reputation, both within and outside the palace, was exemplary. He was the kind of individual who earned trust slowly and commanded respect effortlessly. Harry, like many others in his life, relied on this trust implicitly, never imagining that it could be misplaced, misused, or manipulated. But appearances can be deceiving. The palace is a world of layers. Every gesture, every movement, every interaction carries multiple meanings. Staff members, aides, and those in close proximity learn to read subtle cues. The way someone adjusts a cufflink, a glance held a second too long, a shift in posture. And it is within this intricate dance of perception and reality that the first seeds of suspicion began to emerge. At first, they were almost imperceptible, a lingering presence in the wrong room, a casual comment that seemed out of place, a tone that hinted at familiarity beyond the professional. Yet, for someone attuned to nuance, someone like Harry, these anomalies were not easily dismissed. The bodyguard was not just a figure of security, he was omnipresent. At public events, he was the silent sentinel standing just out of frame, scanning the crowd, ready to intervene. At private gatherings, he moved with the ease of someone who belonged, familiar with routines, preferences, and personal habits. This proximity, once comforting, would become a source of vulnerability. Trust, once absolute, began to be tinged with uncertainty. And uncertainty, left unchecked, can metastasize into suspicion, doubt, and ultimately, heartbreak. The dynamics between Harry, his wife, and the bodyguard were subtle, almost imperceptible to those outside the inner circle. There were no overt confrontations, no immediate signs of impropriety, just small, repeated interactions that suggested a level of intimacy inappropriate for a professional relationship. A shared laugh that lasted too long, a look exchanged in passing that seemed charged with meaning, the occasional unexplained absence during moments that should have been private. Each event, taken alone, could be dismissed. Taken together, however, they painted a different picture, a picture that Harry would come to understand in devastating detail. It is worth pausing to consider the psychology at play. People in positions of power and privilege are often surrounded by individuals who understand the importance of discretion. They are trained to navigate social nuances, to anticipate needs, and to maintain appearances at all costs. A bodyguard, by profession, embodies these traits. But when professional boundaries blur with personal desire, the consequences can be catastrophic. What begins as subtle manipulation or flirtation can escalate into repeated encounters, secrecy, and emotional entanglement that no amount of training can prevent. The first inklings of impropriety did not come from a single glaring incident. They came from patterns, small, almost imperceptible shifts in behavior that suggested something more than professional duty. Harry noticed these patterns, initially brushing them aside, unwilling to entertain the possibility that someone so trusted could violate both personal and professional boundaries. But the mind, especially one attuned to observation and nuance, cannot ignore repeated anomalies. Each one adds weight, each one builds tension, and each one moves closer to an unavoidable confrontation with reality. The bodyguard's proximity gave him access that few could imagine. He knew routines, schedules, and preferences. He understood the unspoken language of the palace, the subtle signals, the coded gestures, the private moments that were supposed to remain hidden. And within this knowledge lay opportunity, the opportunity to manipulate, to intrude, and ultimately, to betray. For Harry, the realization that the very person entrusted with his protection could also be involved in a pattern of repeated intimacy with his wife was not just shocking, it was devastating. But betrayal rarely arrives fully formed. It begins with small actions that test limits, probe reactions, and exploit vulnerabilities. In this case, the bodyguard's behavior was initially ambiguous. Was it friendly? Protective? Overly familiar? At first, Harry asked himself these questions, grappling with the cognitive dissonance of someone he trusted exhibiting behavior that seemed out of place. And this uncertainty is what makes betrayal so insidious. It grows quietly, invisibly, until the moment of revelation strikes with maximum emotional impact. The palace staff, often hyper-aware of subtle shifts, began to notice anomalies as well. Whispers, glances, and fleeting observations contributed to a growing sense of unease. Yet, in such an environment, speaking out carries risk. Allegations against trusted personnel or members of the royal family are dangerous, potentially career-ending, and fraught with political and personal consequences. And so, the tension remained contained, simmering beneath the surface, until it could no longer be ignored. For Harry, the duality of the situation was excruciating. The bodyguard was both a protector and a source of betrayal, someone whose presence was essential for safety, yet now emblematic of personal devastation. Navigating this duality required an extraordinary level of composure, resilience, and emotional intelligence. Yet, as human beings, even those trained for crisis cannot escape the emotional toll of intimate betrayal, especially when it is repeated, deliberate, and emotionally manipulative. And what made the betrayal more painful was its repeated nature. This was not a single lapse in judgment or a fleeting moment of weakness. It was an ongoing pattern, multiple incidents of intimacy that violated trust at its deepest level. Each encounter compounded the emotional impact, each moment a reminder that loyalty had been fractured. For someone like Harry, who had spent a lifetime under public scrutiny, the emotional stakes were intensified. The betrayal was not just personal. It had public ramifications, threatening the image of a marriage long held up as a symbol of unity and love. Yet, even as these patterns emerged, there were moments of denial, moments when Harry questioned his own perceptions. Could he be mistaken? Was he misinterpreting friendly interactions as something more? These moments of doubt are common in situations of betrayal, and they serve to heighten emotional tension. The mind seeks evidence to confirm or disprove suspicions, oscillating between fear and hope, despair and disbelief. Ultimately, the bodyguard's proximity, professionalism, and access made the eventual revelation inevitable. It was only a matter of time before the pattern could no longer be ignored, and the truth would be revealed in stark, undeniable detail. Harry's discovery, when it came, would be a collision of observation, intuition, and undeniable evidence. It was a moment that no amount of preparation, experience, or privilege could soften, a moment that would redefine his understanding of trust, loyalty, and the fragility of human relationships. And as the story unfolds, one must ask, how could someone so trusted become the instrument of repeated betrayal? How could the very person charged with protection exploit that trust to such devastating effect? The answers lie not in speculation alone, but in the subtle accumulation of behavior, the quiet erosion of boundaries, and the emotional vulnerabilities that exist even in lives seemingly insulated from harm. The stage was set, the players in place, and the tension mounting. Harry's world, carefully curated and meticulously maintained, was about to be shaken by a revelation that would expose not just personal betrayal, but the complexities of human desire, secrecy, and the consequences of trust misplaced. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It only takes one instant to change everything. One fleeting glance, one overheard word, one moment that forever shatters your perception of reality. For Prince Harry, that moment came quietly, almost innocuously, in the space he had always considered safe, his home. A place of refuge, a sanctuary from the glare of the public eye, suddenly became the site of a revelation so shocking it would haunt him endlessly. Imagine being confronted with a truth that you had only suspected in fragments, a truth that your mind refused to fully accept until the evidence was undeniable. This was Harry's reality. The first unthinkable discovery of betrayal that would alter the course of his life. The tension had been building, though Harry did not yet fully understand it. Subtle shifts in behavior, fleeting interactions, and whispered suspicions had planted seeds of unease. At first, these were dismissed as paranoia, the inevitable anxiety of a life lived under constant scrutiny. But intuition, honed by years of navigating public and private pressures, warned him that something was amiss. And then came the moment that cut through doubt like a blade. It was not a dramatic confrontation, at least not at first. There was no shouting, no immediate accusations. Instead, it was the quiet realization, the accumulation of small, undeniable facts that crystallized into an unavoidable truth. Perhaps it was a glance caught in a hallway, a private gesture observed from a distance, or an inconsistency in behavior that suddenly made perfect sense. The mind, when confronted with betrayal, often pieces together a mosaic from fragments, connecting dots that had previously seemed innocuous. For Harry, the pieces aligned with devastating clarity. In that moment, the palace, a place steeped in centuries of tradition, ceremony, and formality, felt impossibly claustrophobic. Every corridor, every door, every private room seemed to echo with the weight of what had occurred. The bodyguard, once a symbol of safety and vigilance, was now the center of suspicion, entwined in a narrative of deceit that Harry had never imagined. And his wife, the partner with whom he had shared love, dreams, and private moments, became a figure of incomprehensible contradiction, the same person capable of both affection and betrayal. Emotional reality collided with logical assessment. Harry's mind raced, attempting to reconcile the evidence with the life he had known. How could someone so close, so trusted, have engaged in multiple acts of intimacy with someone under their roof? How could betrayal occur so flagrantly, so repeatedly, without detection? The answer lay not in a single act, but in a series of calculated choices, each one exploiting trust, proximity, and the human desire for discretion. The emotional impact of this first discovery was immediate and visceral. Shock gave way to disbelief, disbelief to anger, and anger to heartbreak. The cycle of emotions was not linear. It ebbed and flowed, revisiting him in waves, each more intense than the last. The betrayal was not only about the acts themselves, but about what they represented: a violation of trust, an erosion of intimacy, and a fracture in the foundation of his marriage. Trust, once absolute, had been systematically dismantled in ways that were both intimate and profoundly public, given the eventual knowledge that would emerge beyond the palace walls. One of the most insidious aspects of betrayal is its ability to distort perception. In the days following his first discovery, Harry found himself questioning every interaction, every gesture, every moment of closeness he had shared with his spouse. Could a laugh have been genuine, or was it performative? Was a touch of affection sincere, or a calculated act to conceal duplicity? The mind, when confronted with repeated deception, begins to search for patterns, to reconstruct the narrative in a way that makes sense, even as the emotional toll deepens. Yet, despite the devastation, there was a clarity that emerged from the initial shock. The first discovery, horrifying as it was, served as a lens through which subsequent revelations could be understood. The seemingly minor anomalies, moments that Harry had previously dismissed, now formed a coherent, if painful, pattern. Each incident of intimacy, each breach of trust, became part of a larger story, a narrative of repeated betrayal that had quietly unfolded over time. The realization was not just personal, it was structural, revealing the fragility of boundaries and the vulnerabilities inherent even in lives insulated by privilege, protocol, and power. The palace itself, with its labyrinthine halls and layers of secrecy, seemed to amplify the betrayal. What had once been a sanctuary now felt like a theater of observation. Staff members, who had previously moved silently through their duties, became potential witnesses to acts Harry had only begun to suspect. Each interaction, each casual exchange, carried weight, as the possibility of further deception loomed. And the very mechanisms of protection, the bodyguards, the aides, the layers of security, paradoxically created both opportunity and risk, highlighting how trust, once violated, can compromise every aspect of daily life. What made this first discovery particularly harrowing was its combination of intimacy and repetition. This was not a single lapse, a momentary mistake, or an accident of circumstance. It was deliberate, intentional, and repeated, a pattern of behavior that violated both personal and professional boundaries. Each incident was a dagger in the heart, each repetition an affirmation of betrayal. For Harry, the emotional weight of these repeated acts was compounded by the impossibility of unseeing or undoing what had been witnessed, felt, and experienced. The initial confrontation with this reality required composure that was nearly superhuman. Harry, accustomed to public scrutiny, understood the necessity of restraint in the face of revelation. Yet, restraint does not erase emotion. It contains it temporarily, creating a tension that demands resolution. The first discovery planted the seeds of a journey that would encompass anger, heartbreak, confrontation, and ultimately, a reevaluation of trust, loyalty, and personal boundaries. Even as the initial shock faded, the questions remained, gnawing at the edges of Harry's mind. How had this been allowed to continue? Who else knew? And most importantly, what would be the consequences? Not just for the relationship, but for the emotional fabric of a life lived under the constant gaze of the world? Each question demanded answers. Each answer promised emotional turbulence, and each moment of reflection brought with it the realization that nothing would ever be the same. The significance of this first discovery cannot be overstated. It marked the transition from suspicion to certainty, from the abstract fear of betrayal to the concrete reality of it. It exposed the fragility of trust, the complexity of human desire, and the vulnerability of relationships, even those that appear most secure. And it was only the beginning. For what Harry had discovered in that quiet, private moment was merely the surface of a deeper, more intricate pattern of deception that would unfold with devastating clarity. And as he grappled with the first unthinkable moment, Harry could not have anticipated the cascade of revelations still to come, the emotional trials that would test the limits of his composure, or the ultimate confrontation with truth that would redefine his understanding of loyalty and intimacy. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What begins as subtle, almost imperceptible deception can quickly spiral into something uncontrollable. For Prince Harry, the realization of betrayal was just the opening act in a story that would escalate far beyond what he could have imagined. The initial shock, the first unthinkable moment of discovery, was merely the gateway into a pattern of repeated intimacy, secrecy, and emotional manipulation that would define the unfolding scandal. Imagine the tension of knowing that someone so close, so trusted, was not only violating personal boundaries, but doing so repeatedly. And right under your nose. That is the emotional crucible Harry found himself in, one incident after another, each more jarring than the last. At first, there was disbelief, the mind's natural defense against betrayal. Harry struggled to reconcile the affection and connection he had once felt with the evidence of multiple clandestine encounters. How could someone capable of love also be capable of repeated deceit? It is a paradox that few outside such intimate circumstances can fully grasp. The cognitive dissonance, the push and pull between trust and betrayal, creates an emotional tension that can feel almost unbearable. And in the case of a high-profile royal, that tension is magnified by the constant scrutiny of the outside world, even when unaware of the specifics. The escalation was not abrupt, but insidious. Each encounter built upon the last, establishing a pattern that was difficult to ignore. Small moments, lingering looks, subtle touches, private conversations, combined to form a narrative of intimacy that violated the unspoken rules of marriage and professional boundaries alike. These moments were often brief, carefully concealed, but they carried the weight of emotional and physical betrayal. Harry, sensitive to nuance and attuned to behavioral shifts, began to notice a sequence emerging, one that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or misunderstanding. The palace environment, paradoxically, enabled the affair to escalate. It was a place of proximity, security, and discretion. The bodyguard's constant presence provided access, opportunity, and cover. Walls that seemed protective were, in fact, instruments that facilitated secrecy. In this context, repetition became possible. The very structure of daily life allowed intimate encounters to occur multiple times without immediate detection. Each instance deepened the betrayal, compounding the emotional trauma and eroding the foundation of trust that Harry had believed unshakable. What made the escalation particularly devastating was its emotional component. This was not a matter of convenience or fleeting indiscretion. Each interaction carried intent, awareness, and deliberate choice. There was a calculated element to the betrayal, a manipulation of trust that made each revelation sting with added intensity. Harry was confronted not only with acts themselves, but with the knowledge that they were deliberate, that the person he had loved and trusted had repeatedly chosen deception over fidelity. The psychological impact of repeated betrayal is profound. Harry experienced a spectrum of emotions, anger at being manipulated, despair at the erosion of trust, confusion at reconciling appearances with reality, and grief for the relationship he had believed in. Each encounter forced a re-evaluation of past events, reinterpreting previously innocent gestures through a lens of suspicion and hurt. What had seemed like affection was now tainted with the shadow of duplicity, and each memory was colored by the realization that intimacy had been violated multiple times. Meanwhile, the bodyguard, once emblematic of safety and loyalty, became a focal point of suspicion and emotional conflict. The paradox of protection versus betrayal created a unique psychological pressure. Harry was forced to contend with the fact that someone entrusted to safeguard him, and by extension, the sanctity of his private life, had instead used that trust to exploit the very vulnerabilities it was meant to shield. The emotional complexity of this realization cannot be overstated. It is a betrayal layered with professional violation, emotional manipulation, and personal intimacy. As the affair escalated, subtle patterns became unmistakable. Harry began to recognize the signals, the timing, and the locations that marked these encounters. Certain rooms, certain times of day, and certain routines were exploited, each creating opportunities for intimacy while minimizing the risk of exposure. The precision of these actions suggested not recklessness, but planning, a deliberate strategy that made the betrayal feel both personal and calculated. For Harry, every realization of a repeated incident magnified the emotional pain, reinforcing the depth of deceit and the extent of boundary violations. Yet, even in the midst of escalating betrayal, the external world remained largely unaware. Public appearances continued, smiles were exchanged for the cameras, and the facade of marital harmony persisted. The contrast between private reality and public image heightened the tension, creating a surreal experience of living a double life. Harry, forced to navigate this dichotomy, experienced an emotional layering that compounded stress, grief, and disbelief. The public saw the royal fairy tale. He experienced the unraveling of trust in real time. Adding to the complexity were the interactions with staff and aides, some of whom had begun to notice anomalies. Whispers, glances, and subtle signs suggested that the secretive behavior was not entirely hidden. Yet, speaking out in the palace carries profound risk. Careers, reputations, and loyalties are on the line. The isolation of knowledge, coupled with the impossibility of confronting the situation publicly, created a pressure cooker of emotion. Harry had to process the repeated betrayal internally, strategizing privately how to address it without triggering wider fallout prematurely. The emotional stakes escalated alongside the physical acts of intimacy. Each repeated betrayal was an additional wound, not just because of the act itself, but because of the cumulative effect on trust and perception. In human relationships, trust is compounded over time. Each reaffirmation strengthens bonds, and each breach weakens them. Repeated breaches, therefore, create exponential damage. Harry felt the weight of every instance, the emotional toll compounding until it became nearly unbearable. And yet, amid this escalating betrayal, there were moments of clarity. Harry recognized the pattern for what it was. Not random, not accidental, not fleeting, but repeated, deliberate, and emotionally manipulative. This understanding, while painful, was crucial. It allowed him to see the situation clearly, to anticipate potential future incidents, and to prepare mentally for confrontation. Recognition of pattern transforms helplessness into awareness, even if it does not lessen the emotional pain. The escalation of the affair also carried practical implications. The repeated intimacy created risks of exposure, both internally within the palace and externally through media channels. Each incident carried the potential to shatter not only Harry's private life, but also the carefully curated image of the family and institution. The stakes were enormous. Emotional devastation intertwined with the possibility of public scandal, reputational harm, and the amplification of betrayal in ways that would reach global attention. And as the incidents multiplied, the emotional crescendo built. Each revelation, each recognition, each confirmed moment of intimacy intensified the heartbreak. Harry faced not only the reality of repeated infidelity, but also the psychological burden of navigating the palace environment while processing personal devastation. The juxtaposition of public composure and private trauma created a uniquely intense emotional experience, one that would shape the trajectory of his decisions in the weeks and months to follow. The affair, now unmistakably established as ongoing, deliberate, and escalating, transformed Harry's understanding of his marriage, his spouse, and the very dynamics of trust within their relationship. What had begun as suspicion had solidified into undeniable reality, and the consequences were profound. Every interaction, every decision, and every private thought became intertwined with the knowledge of betrayal, creating a ripple effect that would influence every aspect of life within the palace. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. In the modern age, nothing truly stays hidden. Every corner, every shadowed hallway, every private space carries the potential to be observed, recorded, or scrutinized. For Prince Harry, this uncomfortable reality became a terrifying truth. The first discovery of betrayal had been devastating. The pattern of repeated intimacy had escalated the emotional stakes, but nothing compared to the moment when evidence surfaced. Evidence that could no longer be ignored, dismissed, or rationalized away. Evidence that transformed suspicion into irrefutable reality. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. Small inconsistencies in schedules, unexplained absences, and fleeting behaviors that had previously seemed inconsequential suddenly aligned with a disturbing pattern. Harry, acutely aware of these anomalies, began to wonder, had there been proof all along, hidden in plain sight? The possibility was chilling. For someone living under constant observation, where palace security, staff, and even cameras were pervasive, every interaction carries both opportunity and risk. In this case, the risk was personal, intimate, and unavoidable. The role of hidden evidence in betrayal is profound. Unlike suspicion, which can be questioned, debated, or rationalized, tangible proof is definitive. It forces acknowledgement, eliminates ambiguity, and demands confrontation. And for Harry, the emergence of such evidence was not just a confirmation of betrayal. It was a psychological jolt, a confrontation with a reality he had both feared and, until that moment, hoped might be false. The emotional impact was immediate and visceral. Shock, anger, despair, and heartbreak collided in a torrent of sensation that left no room for denial. The evidence took many forms. In a world where security cameras, phones, and other digital devices are ubiquitous, the potential for inadvertent recording is enormous. A brief gesture, a whispered conversation, a private moment captured without intention. Any of these could serve as proof of intimate betrayal. For Harry, the realization that these incidents might have been recorded added layers of complexity. It wasn't simply a matter of emotional betrayal. It was the terrifying possibility that private acts, moments meant to remain hidden, had been documented and could one day surface publicly. Imagine, for a moment, the psychological torment of encountering such evidence. Each image, each video, each trace of intimacy is a reminder of trust violated and boundaries crossed. The mind races, questions multiply, and the heart aches with the knowledge that what was once sacred and private has been exposed to the lens of reality. For Harry, this confrontation was both personal and symbolic. The betrayal was no longer a theory, it was a documented fact, undeniable and haunting. The role of the bodyguard in this equation became even more chilling. His proximity and access had enabled the repeated breaches of trust, but the existence of evidence suggested premeditation or, at the very least, a reckless disregard for discretion. Every interaction was fraught with the possibility of exposure, and the realization that these moments might have been recorded intensified the emotional stakes. For Harry, it was a stark reminder that the person entrusted to protect him had instead become an instrument of betrayal. Compounding the impact of the evidence was the knowledge that exposure could have consequences beyond personal heartbreak. In the palace, reputations are fragile, and the discovery of indiscretions can ripple outward, affecting not just private relationships but public perception, familial ties, and institutional credibility. The evidence, therefore, was not merely proof of betrayal. It was a potential catalyst for scandal on a scale that could reach global attention. For Harry, the weight of this reality added to the emotional burden, creating a pressure cooker of stress, fear, and heartbreak. Yet even in the face of such evidence, emotions were conflicted. There is a peculiar intersection between proof and disbelief, a cognitive paradox in which one knows the truth yet struggles to fully internalize its implications. Harry experienced this duality acutely. Each piece of evidence validated suspicions and confirmed betrayal, yet the emotional shock remained, as if the mind resisted accepting the reality in its entirety. It is a common phenomenon in cases of intimate betrayal. Proof may exist, but emotional processing lags, delayed by the depth of shock, grief, and anger. The emergence of evidence also changed the dynamics of trust within the palace. Staff members, aides, and those with knowledge of the incidents suddenly occupied a new position in Harry's perception. Who had seen, who had known, and who had chosen to remain silent. The very structure that had facilitated secrecy, the combination of proximity, discretion, and loyalty, now became a source of tension, as the potential for revelation loomed over every interaction. For Harry, the emotional labyrinth grew more complex with every new piece of evidence, every confirmation of repeated betrayal, and every unanswered question about the extent of knowledge within his household. It is important to understand that the emotional resonance of hidden evidence is often magnified by repetition. One instance of proof is devastating. Multiple instances create an exponential effect, compounding the emotional trauma and reinforcing the sense of deliberate manipulation. Harry's situation was a textbook example. The pattern of intimacy, the repeated breaches, and now the tangible proof combined to create a reality too painful to ignore. The betrayal was no longer abstract or theoretical. It was documented, undeniable, and unavoidable. The presence of evidence also raised questions about intent and awareness. Had the bodyguard or Harry's spouse anticipated the possibility of exposure? Was there an element of recklessness or defiance in their repeated actions? These questions haunted Harry as he processed the revelations, adding layers of psychological complexity to an already intense emotional experience. Each consideration deepened the understanding of the betrayal while simultaneously amplifying feelings of anger, hurt, and disbelief. Yet even in this darkness, Harry began to recognize a painful clarity. The existence of evidence removed uncertainty, confirming what suspicion and intuition had long suggested. Patterns became readable, moments became understandable, and the trajectory of betrayal became painfully clear. While the emotional toll remained severe, the psychological framework for understanding the repeated infidelity and deceit began to take shape. Harry could now contextualize each incident, interpret subtle signs, and prepare for the confrontation that was inevitable. And still, the presence of hidden evidence raised the stakes for the future. It was not enough to process past betrayal. The possibility of further exposure, public revelation, and institutional scandal created ongoing pressure. Harry faced not only the challenge of reconciling the personal impact of infidelity, but also the looming threat of global attention, media intrusion, and the manipulation of narrative by those with vested interests. Every choice, every action, and every decision carried consequences far beyond the personal sphere. The discovery of hidden evidence is, in many ways, a turning point. It transforms suspicion into certainty, anxiety into clarity, and private unease into undeniable reality. For Harry, this turning point marked the transition from internal questioning to the inevitability of confrontation. It was the moment when the personal heartbreak collided with the structural realities of life within the palace, creating a crucible in which decisions, revelations, and emotional responses would shape the trajectory of the scandal to come. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Confrontation is the moment when private suspicion becomes undeniable truth, when pent-up emotions collide with reality, and when the carefully maintained facades of relationships crumble under the weight of disclosure. For Prince Harry, the confrontation with his wife and the bodyguard was inevitable. After repeated incidents, mounting suspicion, and the chilling discovery of hidden evidence, he could no longer remain in denial. What had started as subtle doubt escalated into an unavoidable reckoning, a moment that would forever redefine the dynamics of trust, loyalty, and emotional security. It began quietly, with Harry gathering his composure and weighing the stakes. The palace, a place of centuries-old tradition and ritual, now felt like a pressure chamber, every room echoing with the tension of anticipation. A confrontation in such an environment is never simple. Walls that have historically protected secrecy now amplified every word, every glance, and every emotional inflection. Harry understood that the stakes were not only personal, but institutional. The emotional stakes of betrayal were entangled with the potential for public exposure, the scrutiny of staff, and the long-lasting impact on family and reputation. The first moments of confrontation were explosive not because of dramatic shouting or public spectacle, but because of the weight of accumulated emotions. The betrayal had been repeated, deliberate, and emotionally manipulative. Every denied suspicion, every small lie, and every hidden interaction added to the intensity of the encounter. Harry's voice, calm but charged, broke the silence, demanding explanations that had long been avoided. The room itself seemed to vibrate with tension, the air thick with unspoken accusations, regret, and anger. Confrontation is as much psychological as it is verbal. Harry's approach combined observation, evidence, and controlled emotion, forcing the perpetrators to face the truth as clearly as he had. Questions were precise, aimed at revealing intent, frequency, and awareness. Each answer, or evasive maneuver, revealed deeper layers of deceit, magnifying the sense of betrayal. The realization that the intimacy had occurred multiple times, in repeated patterns, created a crescendo of emotional impact, leaving little room for rationalization or excuse. For the bodyguard, the confrontation was especially charged. The professional role he had embodied, loyal protector, silent sentinel, trusted confidant, was now in direct conflict with the personal violations he had committed. His demeanor, once calm and composed, faltered under the scrutiny of evidence, repeated questioning, and the intensity of Harry's emotional presence. Every gesture, every hesitation, and every defensive response only served to confirm the pattern of betrayal, reinforcing the emotional devastation already felt by Harry. The confrontation with his wife was even more complex. Emotional entanglement, shared history, and personal intimacy complicated the dialogue. Harry had to navigate a landscape where love, trust, and anger intersected in volatile ways. Questions that had once lingered in the mind demanded direct answers. The multiple instances of intimacy with the bodyguard could no longer be avoided, minimized, or explained away. Each acknowledgement of wrongdoing struck like a blade, deepening the wound and reinforcing the magnitude of betrayal. Emotional spikes during such confrontations are inevitable. Harry experienced waves of disbelief, rage, grief, and even protective instinct for the relationship he had believed in. Yet, amidst the chaos of emotion, there was also clarity. Patterns emerged, truths crystallized, and the timeline of deceit became unmistakably clear. Every repeated act of betrayal, every hidden interaction, and every compromised boundary was now fully accounted for, leaving Harry with both the knowledge and the emotional burden of reality. The confrontation also exposed contradictions, lies, and manipulations that had long been hidden beneath surface-level interactions. Statements previously accepted at face value were now understood as deliberate obfuscations. Actions that seemed innocuous took on sinister undertones in hindsight. Harry had to reconcile not only the acts themselves, but also the systematic deception that allowed them to continue undetected for so long. This duality, act plus concealment, is what made the emotional impact so devastating, turning personal betrayal into a profound psychological upheaval. But confrontation is not only about revelation, it is also about boundaries. Harry had to assert emotional and personal limits, defining what was acceptable and what was no longer tolerable. The process required courage, clarity, and resilience, as well as the willingness to face uncomfortable truths about both the relationship and the people involved. It was a moment that demanded both accountability and introspection, forcing all parties to confront the consequences of repeated choices and the emotional wreckage left in their wake. Even in moments of tension, there is often a strange, almost paradoxical intimacy in confrontation. Harry's emotional honesty, combined with the undeniable evidence, created a scenario where truth could no longer be hidden, excuses could not mask reality, and the psychological dynamics of betrayal were laid bare. For the perpetrators, this was a reckoning. For Harry, it was both cathartic and agonizing. The confrontation crystallized months of uncertainty, suspicion, and fear into a moment of clarity that left no room for ambiguity. Yet, even after the confrontation, the emotional fallout persisted. Betrayal, especially repeated betrayal, does not end with acknowledgement. The aftermath is a complex tapestry of grief, recalibration, and emotional realignment. Harry faced the challenge of processing not only the acts themselves, but also the psychological manipulation, the repeated violation of trust, and the implications for his future relationships. Every word spoken, every gesture observed, and every acknowledgement made during the confrontation would reverberate for months, shaping emotional responses and influencing decisions about trust, security, and intimacy moving forward. The palace, once a sanctuary, now functioned as both stage and audience. Staff members, aides, and close observers were forced to witness the tension, the emotional volatility, and the cracks that betrayal had exposed in what had previously seemed an impenetrable facade. For Harry, this amplified the stakes. The personal confrontation was now entangled with the public perception of composure, loyalty, and dignity. Navigating this intersection of private devastation and potential public awareness demanded a level of emotional control and strategic thinking that few could imagine. By the end of the confrontation, the truth had been fully confronted. The repeated acts of intimacy, the calculated manipulations, and the deliberate violations of trust were now undeniable. Harry had seen, heard, and felt the reality of betrayal in all its dimensions. But acknowledgement, while necessary, was not the conclusion. Confrontation marked the beginning of a new chapter, one in which decisions about boundaries, consequences, and emotional healing would need to be made. The landscape of trust, loyalty, and personal security had been fundamentally altered, and navigating the aftermath would require both courage and resilience. And as the confrontation ended, leaving a mix of raw emotion and unresolved questions, one reality became clear. Nothing would ever be the same, and the next moves by Harry, his wife, and those around them would shape a story that was still unfolding, with stakes higher than anyone could have imagined. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Betrayal leaves scars that no public apology or private justification can erase. For Prince Harry, the confrontation behind closed doors was only the beginning.